Alright, let's talk about the principles of flight. So, just in general, um, before, to become a pilot, you don't have to have this technical course in the science of aerodynamics because that gets extremely complicated really, really fast. But a competent pilot will have a well founded concept of the forces in which act upon the aircraft. So, understanding the advantage use of these forces as well as the operating limits of a particular aircraft is important for mastering that airplane. All right, so we have four forces of flight. First is lift, the upward acting force that opposes weight created by our wings. Then there's weight, it opposes lift. It's caused by the downward pull of gravity. We have our thrust, that's our forward force propelling that aircraft through the air. It opposes drag. That leads us to drag. It's opposite of thrust. It's the backwards force, the retarding force that limits the speed of the airplane. So let's cover some terminology here. First is chord line. It's the imaginary line drawn from the front of our wing or the leading edge and the very back of our wing or the trailing edge. And so the line drawn between the very front, the leading edge, and the trailing edge is our chord line. Now, our relative wind is the direction of the wind relative to the aircraft's flight path. So it's always opposite the aircraft's flight path. So if we're maintaining altitude, that's just going to be straight and level. And the angle of attack is the angle between the chord line and the relative wind. So we can see this bottom line here, given that we're maintaining our particular altitude, will be this flat horizontal line, and then we have that angle of attack, which is, again, leading edge, trailing edge, line drawn between the two. So at high speed, we're at a low angle of attack. At low speed, we're flying at a higher angle of attack if we're maintaining altitude in order to create sufficient lift to create enough lift to oppose the weight of the aircraft. So we'll get more into that in a little bit. All right, so some principles of lift. There are two main principles that explain lift. The first is Bernoulli's principle. As the velocity of fluid air increases, its pressure decreases. So we have a curvature of the upper portion of the wing. Here, I drew a little model here. Let's just say this is our wing right here. And these little lines are the streams of airflow around the wing. Well, as air moves above the wing, it gets pinched, as you can see. It gets pinched as it moves above the wing. And so what happens is, similar to how if you have your hose and you put your thumb over the top and that pinches that air into a smaller, tighter area, that water will accelerate. Same thing with the airflow over our wing. It gets pinched and it accelerates. And what Bernoulli's principle states is that as the speed of a moving fluid changes, the speed of our air, which is a moving fluid, changes, its pressure changes. So as this air speeds up over the top, we get an area of low pressure. It's going to be an L for low pressure. And then underneath the wing, the airflow slows down. So underneath the wing, we get an area of high pressure. Now, high pressure is constantly seeking out low pressure. So just for simplicity's sake, the resultant force is upwards. So again, Bernoulli's principle, low pressure created above the wing because the air accelerates, higher pressure beneath the wing because the air slows down. That high pressure to low pressure resultant force is upward. Next is Newton's third law. So for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So the downwash of air above and below the wing will create a the action of the, let me pull up that paint again. So as we can see, the air is curving behind the wing, and then moving down. You can see the trail of that moving down. So since this airfoil, since our wing is turning that airflow downwards, The equal and opposite reaction is a force upwards on our airfoil. So since the airflow is being turned downward and backward, the equal and opposite reaction is an upward force on our wing. All right, let's go back to the slideshow. I might pull up Paint though, that program in the future to help explain. So lift is provided by an airfoil or our wing. An airfoil is just any surface providing an aerodynamic force when it interacts with a moving stream of air. Technically, the body or the fuselage of the aircraft is an airfoil, but it does a whole lot worse of a job at creating lift than our wing does. So our wing takes advantage of Newton's laws and Bernoulli's laws by having curvature on the upper portion of the wing. This is called camber. So the more camber, the more curvature of the wing, the more downwards, backwards directed flow for Newton's third law, and the larger pressure differential above and beneath the wing, leading to more lift. So in summary, the more camber you have in a wing, the more lift generally it will produce. All right, so the lift equation is, now this isn't a super important thing to memorize. I've got a fun little, what is it, acronym, if you will, to help memorize it. But lift equals 1/2 PCL V2S. Doesn't make any sense. Let's make sense of it. But the acronym I use 1/2 pint, chug a liter, vomit twice, sleep it off. That's helps me remember it. It's not super important to remember at the private pilot level, but that's how I memorize it. Basically, all that P is our air density, which as a pilot we can't control for a given day. When we go out and fly, we're just dealing with the conditions that we have for that day. So we can't control this, but we can control our coefficient of lift, our airspeed, and our surface area. So our coefficient of lift is related to the angle of attack that our wing is producing. Remember, the angle of attack is the difference between our chord line and our relative wind. Changes in pitch change our angle of attack, therefore increase lift or decrease lift. Airspeed, lift is proportional to the square of our airspeed, so the more airflow we have moving around our wings, the more lift that we're going to be creating. And surface area, so we have flaps. We don't have slats on our aircraft, but we have flaps that increase the surface area of the wing, that increases lift and increases drag. So that's how we manipulate lift. We manipulate our angle of attack, we manipulate our airspeed, and our surface area through the use of our flaps. All right, let's talk about weight. Weight is the force of gravity that acts vertically through the center of gravity towards the Earth. When lift equals weight, the plane doesn't gain or lose any altitude. We maintain our altitude. But if weight is greater than lift, the plane will descend. If lift is greater than weight, the plane will climb. Thrust, so is our forward force created by our propeller that opposes drag. Force equals mass times acceleration. An airplane will continue to accelerate until thrust is equal to drag. So if thrust is greater than drag, our aircraft accelerates. If thrust is less than drag, our aircraft decelerates. Before I get to the types of drag, when we say the aircraft is in equilibrium, we mean that lift equals weight and thrust equals drag. So if we're in steady, unaccelerated flight and we're maintaining our altitude, we are in the aircraft is in what's called equilibrium, where again, lift equals weight, thrust equals drag. Now let's talk a little bit more about drag. There are two main types of drag. There is parasite drag and there is induced drag. Now we'll start with parasite drag. That's the simpler of the two to understand. Parasite drag is surfaces interfering with smooth airflow. Basically, the shape of of the object moving through the air, creating drag. And there's three types of parasite drag. There's form drag. This is the size and shape of the aircraft. So if I have my hand sticking outside the side of the window when I'm driving down the highway, and I have my hand sticking out vertically, I'm going to create more drag than if my hand was positioned horizontal relative to the wind, because that form is larger. And so the airflow separates greater on that vertical hand when compared to the horizontal hand, creating more drag. The next is interference. So this is created by different merging, this is by varied currents of air interacting. So where we see this is where the wing connects to the body or the fuselage of the aircraft. Those intersecting airflows, right where these two shapes meet, the airflow from both of those shapes will merge, creating additional drag. And then the last is skin friction, the roughness of the aircraft surface. So if we have an aircraft that has been sitting forever, hasn't been flown in forever, it develops rust and gets dirty, then that will lead to an increase in skin friction drag. Even on a brand new aircraft right out of the factory, you feel the leading edge of the wing in your pre-flight, and it's like the smoothest thing you've ever felt. But even at the microscopic level, it's not perfectly smooth. So there's some level of skin friction drag always, even on brand new aircraft. And it's really minuscule in performance, but when it doesn't become minuscule is when you have rust or dirt buildup, or even something like frost or ice developing on the wings and the surface of the aircraft. All right, so that's parasite drag. It's those three types: form, interference, and skin friction. The next type of drag is induced drag. It's induced as a byproduct of lift, and it's caused by the creation of wingtip vortices. So we talked before about how Bernoulli's principle, underneath the wing, we have a high pressure, and above the wing we have a low pressure. Well, the third dimension now that we have to think about is on the wingtip. That high pressure is always seeking the path of least resistance to the area of low pressure. So around the wingtip, that high pressure moves out, above, and into the area of low pressure. And that, in effect, creates these vortices, as you can see right here. These vortices will induce a downwash, which tilts the lift vector backward. So I can see in this picture in the bottom left, instead of my lift vector being completely vertical, these vortices will shift it aft. And so this horizontal component here of comparing that aft shifted lift vector to the vertical lift vector is induced drag. So total drag is just parasite drag plus induced drag. So as we can see right here, this orange line is our total drag, and all we're doing is adding up our induced drag and our parasite drag. So if I just took, maybe right here, for example, I just add up this line here, and that gives me the total drag I'll be experiencing at this specific airspeed. Our LD max is where we create the most amount of lift with the least amount of drag. So this is the airspeed and the aircraft glides the farthest. We're creating the least amount of drag for the most amount of lift. So in my aircraft, that's 68 knots. As you can see, induced drag is higher the slower we get. Now it makes sense that parasite drag would be not as large at these slower speeds. If I'm sticking my hand out the window at 30 miles an hour, I'm not going to create as much drag versus if I'm barreling down the highway at 70 miles per hour, then I stick my hand out, I'm going to create more drag. But why does induced drag get greater as we slow down? Well, when we slow down and we get slower in our aircraft, we have to pitch higher and increase our angle of attack in order to maintain our altitude. And when we increase our angle of attack, the pressure differential below and above the wing gets greater, leading to stronger wingtip vortices, meaning the slower we get and the more we increase our angle of attack, the further aft this lift vector gets shifted, leading to more induced drag. So any airspeed that's behind our LD max is called the region of reverse command. And so here, let's start with the region of normal command. As airspeed decreases, this is usually when we're at our cruising altitude. As airspeed decreases, total drag decreases, which then will situate us running into less drag, and so we're inherently stable. So if I get too fast, I run into more drag, and it keeps me stable. I get slow, less drag. So the speed that I'm at is stable. This is the region of normal command. And if I asked someone, you know, if I'm, I'm gonna try doing this with, it's hard to like draw things out with my mouse. But if I just asked you, hey, if we're flying at our normal cruise speed and I wanted you to increase your airspeed, how would you do that? And, you know, we're just flying straight and level, you know, maybe 100 knots indicated airspeed. You would say, oh, well, I'd increase my power to increase my airspeed. So let's say region of normal command, you increase power to increase air speed. It is hard to to draw with my mouse. I'm not used to that. All right, and then if we were, you know, I can increase my power and increase my airspeed. Then if I say, hey, I want you to climb. Then, okay, well, I'm just going to pull this yoke back. So now, in the region of normal command, you know, if I were to say to descend, you'd push the yoke forward. So now my pitch controls my altitude. All right, and that makes sense. Now we have what's called the region of reverse command. And the reason it's called that is because it's reversed. So now, if I'm, you know, maybe I'm in slow flight and I'm, you know, flying like right here. Let me make this bigger. Now, if I increase my airspeed, I run into less drag, meaning the aircraft will inherently want to continue to gain more air or continue to get faster. Same thing as if I lose airspeed, I increase my drag because I need to create a higher angle of attack, more induced drag. And so now if I'm maintaining an airspeed in this region of reverse command, you know, everything to the left of my LD max here, it will inherently want to keep slipping away from me on either side. It will inherently want to get faster or slower. And one way I think about this total drag curve is I can almost think about that as the thrust required in order to maintain that speed, because I'm increasing drag and thrust is the opposite of drag. So at this point, drag begins to increase. Slower airspeeds require higher power settings. So I can think about I get even slower and I need a higher power setting in order to maintain this airspeed because of the increased drag. So what's backwards about the region of reverse command is now, let's just say reverse command. Now I'll use my power to control my altitude. It is so hard to type. And I use my pitch to control my airspeed. Pitch for airspeed, power for altitude. And so you'll hear that when we land the aircraft, because when we're landing the aircraft, we're at a speed in which we're either at the LD max or lower, especially if we're doing a short field approach. And in this regime of flight, we pitch for the airspeed we want, and we use our power to maintain our altitude. So that's why it's the region of reverse command. It's different and counterintuitive to when we're normally operating in the region of normal command. All right, let's get back to the slideshow. Airfoil design terminology. So we talked about camber before. Camber is the curvature of the upper and lower surface. So following the curvature of the wing, remember the chord line was a straight line between the trailing edge and the leading edge. Our camber kind of follows the contour, follows that curvature of the wing. And our leading and trailing edge, we have a rounded leading edge and generally a narrow tapered trailing edge. So this takes advantage of the low pressure above. We have faster moving air above, creating that area of low pressure. And then our high pressure beneath, we have our slowed down air, or our stagnation point, which all the stagnation point is the air that flies underneath. Say this air parcel right here hits right here, and the airflow is virtually stopped and then slowly speeds up as it moves underneath. And Newton's third law, or Bernoulli's law, states for where that airflow is slowed, there is higher pressure. So that's the reason for the high pressure there, and that's all that stagnation point is. And the downwash from above the wing and the deflection below the wing result in a force upwards because we're reflecting that airflow downwards due to Newton's third law. Aircraft weight and speed and purpose dictate the airfoil design. So there's a bunch of different airfoil types depending on the needs of the aircraft. Pressure distribution. So this will vary with angle of attack. We could think of our center of pressure as the mathematical average from which we can calculate lift to be being produced from. Just as we could calculate center of gravity to be where mass is concentrated, balancing my phone on one finger, the center of gravity is in the middle. Think about this in the opposite sort of way. The center of pressure is where the mathematical center in which lift is being produced by the wing. And it moves depending on our angle of attack. So on a lower angle of attack, our center of pressure moves aft, moves back. And then on a higher angle of attack, this center of pressure moves forward. All right, let's talk about wing plan forms. The plan form is just the shape of the wing when viewed from a bird's eye view. And different wing plan forms will have different effects, and there's different reasons to have different types of wing plan forms. Let's go over these kind of some terms. So taper is the ratio of chord from wing root to tip. So basically the chord length of, this was a big taper, so we'll use this as an example. The length of the wing at the root versus at the tip. So the larger the taper, see a high taper, it's shorter at the wingtip and larger at the wing root, versus moderate taper, it's not as exaggerated. That's all a taper is. Generally decreases drag, increases lift, reduces weight. Aspect ratio is the ratio of wingspan to wing chord. So the ratio of how long a wing is versus how wide it is. A higher aspect ratio will decrease drag. A low aspect ratio is used for extreme maneuverability and strength. So, we could think of a long, super wide wings on like a glider that has these really long, skinny wings, and they're very aerodynamically efficient, versus a low aspect ratio, which you'd see on like a, maybe like a fighter jet for extreme maneuverability and strength. And then sweep is the slant of a wing. So here's an example of a swept back wing. It's usually rearward, can be forward. I've never even heard of an aircraft with a forward sweep. I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole here, but helps with lateral stability in low speed planes. So if the aircraft will inherently want to stay stable and not roll, inherently want to stay wings level. So let's talk about some wing plan forms. The rectangular wing, so this is this one on the top right. It's desirable stall characteristics, meaning it'll stall from the wing root. And that's important because it gives sufficient stall warning beforehand in that buffet and that loss of elevator control. Because if I'm losing lift right here, all that wind that was hitting my horizontal stabilizer is now being disrupted, so the aircraft will naturally want to nose down even before a stall happens in order to regain airflow over the wing. It also allows for some aileron effectiveness in a stall. It's economical to design and manufacture. The bad is that it's not as aerodynamically efficient as other wing plan forms, leading to more induced drag, and it's more weight when compared to a tapered wing, given it's like the same size. So that's like a debatable point right there. Taper is, again, the ratio of wing chord from root to tip. So saves weight when compared to the rectangular wing, given it's the same aspect ratio. So this is contentious right here, this point here. It's aerodynamically efficient, but not as much as an elliptical, but more aerodynamically efficient than a regular wing. The bad, it doesn't have as desirable a stall characteristics as this regular wing. So if I even take this moderate tapered wing, it's not stalling from the root, it's stalling from the back of the wing. Or on a high tapered wing, it's almost stalling at the wingtips. Next is our elliptical wing. So that's this wing right here, these kind of rounded, the rounded wing pattern. You see it on like a P-51 Mustang. It's very aerodynamically efficient, meaning there's minimum induced drag. The bad is it has undesirable stall characteristics, so we don't get the desirable stall characteristics and the stall warnings we get from the regular wing. Next is the swept-back ring. So it's reduced drag and transonic flight. Not going to get super in-depth on that. It's inherently laterally stable and has undesirable stall characteristics. It stalls from the wingtips, which can potentially lead to a stall. This is the wings we see on most practically every airliner. Now let's talk about stability. Stability is the inherent quality of the aircraft to correct conditions that disturb equilibrium and for it to return to its original state. Inherently the aircraft is doing this without any pilot inputs. So there's static stability. So static stability is just the aircraft's initial tendency to a disturbed condition. So if I am flying and all of a sudden I push the yoke forward, will that aircraft try to pitch back up? Will it stay at that new position that I pitched the nose down, or will it worsen over time? And that'll tell me if it's positive, negative, or neutral static stability. So positive. So let's say this is what happened right here. I pushed that nose down, and then the aircraft immediately pitched back up. Then that tells me that that's positive static stability. If it's negative static stability, I push that nose down, and then the nose continues to trend down. Neutral means it remains in its new condition. I push that nose down, and then the nose stays there. We have in our aircraft positive static stability. Now, the other half of stability is dynamic stability, the aircraft's response over time to a disturbed condition. So if I push forward and the aircraft creates these oscillations, will that aircraft return to level flight in its original condition inherently? And that'll let me know if it's dynamically positive, negative, or neutral. So if I push the nose down, and inherently the aircraft's oscillations start to get lessened, and all of a sudden we're back to straight level flight, that's positive static stability and positive dynamic stability, which is what we have in our aircraft. Now, say I push that nose down, all of a sudden these oscillations don't get any better. That aircraft is just going up and down like waves consistently. then that's neutral dynamic stability. The aircraft's response over time to the disturbed condition is staying the same. Now, if I have this happen where these oscillations are getting worse over time, that's negative dynamic stability. So if I look at this example, I push the nose down, its initial tendency is to pitch back up. So I've got positive static stability, but negative dynamic stability. So in our aircraft, we have positive static stability and positive dynamic stability. These Cessna and Trainer aircraft are made with stability in mind. Now let's talk about stability on the longitudinal axis. Or excuse me, the lateral axis. This is our pitch axis, our up and down, called longitudinal stability. So a stable aircraft, if the plane is nose down, the wing and tail will create additional tail down force to bring that nose back up. So this is all due to downwash from the wings that strike the top of our horizontal stabilizer that produces a downward pressure. So if I pitch down, airflow over the wings increases, leading to more tail down force, pushing the nose back up, allowing the aircraft to inherently recover from that nose down condition. The same thing is true as if all of a sudden I pitch up. That loss of airspeed from pitching up reduces in less airflow over the wing, reducing in less tail down force, meaning the aircraft will, the tail will go up and the nose will go back down, and resulting in the aircraft being inherently positively stable. Now let's talk about stability around the lateral or the longitudinal axis for our lateral stability. This is stability around in the axis in which the aircraft will bank. Our aircraft has a dihedral, so it's that upwards angle from root to tip, as you can see right here. We have a slight dihedral on our aircraft, and sweepback has a similar effect to a dihedral, where if I'm flying along and all of a sudden a gust of wind slips my aircraft and dips one wing down, the lower wing will have an increased angle of attack due to the slide slip. Therefore, more lift is being created by that lowered wing, restoring the aircraft into level flight. That's the effect of a dihedral and a sweepback wing. The next is keel effect. Now, this is the effect that's predominantly on high-wing aircraft that turns or that rolls the aircraft into the direction of the relative wind. So our fuselage acts like a keel under a ship, and if that aircraft hits a gust of wind and it pushes it to one side, the combination of the aircraft's weight and the pressure and airflow against the upper portion of the keel or our fuselage will roll that aircraft back to wings level. So that's why aircraft with low wings have a larger dihedral angle, because they don't get the keel effect benefits as much as high wing aircraft. So if you look at pictures of low wing aircraft, they'll have a larger dihedral than these high wing 172s. I've got a little video there. I'm going to skip that. Directional stability. So this is the stability most easily attained by aircraft manufacturers. Directional stability is around the vertical axis, or the yaw motion of our aircraft. All aircraft manufacturers have to do is create a larger surface area from behind our center of gravity than in front, and then the aircraft itself will act like a weather vane. So if my relative wind is directly here from the left, it has all this surface area here to the wind pushes against and yaws the aircraft into the wind, into the flight path. And that's the easiest one to understand. All right, we've got some left turning tendencies when it comes to single engine propeller aircraft. So the first is Torque effect. So Newton's third law, as we talked about earlier, there's an equal and opposite reaction to every action. So as our propeller rotates, let's say this is not from the pilot perspective, but our propeller is rotating counterclockwise when looking at the aircraft from the front. The opposite, the equal and opposite reaction is a banking of our aircraft to the left. So torque effect is a left banking effect. And even when we start the aircraft, if you look out to the left side of the wing, as you turn on that engine, that propeller starts going, the left wing will dip just for a second, and that's that torque effect. So the faster our propeller is spinning, the more torque effect we're going to feel. So that's why we feel it when we increase our power, especially during like our takeoff roll. Spiraling slipstream. Our prop rotates, spiraling air around our aircraft, hitting the horizontal stabilizer on the left side, yawing that aircraft to the left. That's an easy one to understand. P factor. Now this is a hard one for people to understand, and I'm going to do my best to explain it here. Our descending blade. So here's a picture right here. Let's see if this can. Our descending blade is on the, from the pilot's perspective, the right side. So that right side descending blade has a bigger angle of attack on the relative wind than the left side upward ascending blade. Meaning more thrust is being created by the right side of our propeller than the left side when we are in higher angles of attack. The higher the angle of attack, the stronger P factor, the stronger P factor will be noticed. Let's say I have my hand sticking out my car window and I move my hand, backwards to forwards from, kind of the back of the car to the front. And I'm pushing against the stream of air. That's kind of, and let's counter that to me moving my hand backwards with the airflow with my hand sticking out the window. I'm going to create more force moving against the airflow than moving with it. And I hope this makes sense. Let's say we're at a high angle of attack like this, right? This right side is almost slicing into the relative wind, where this left ascending side is moving against with the wind. So moving into the wind, that blade is traveling through more air, creating more thrust than this ascending blade that's traveling almost in the tailwind. So that's why it's more exaggerated in the higher the angle of attack. If this nose is pitched up more, then that right blade is slicing more into the direct oncoming relative wind. So that is P factor, or also known as asymmetric loading. Gyroscopic precession. It's more prominent in tailwheel aircraft when the tail is raised for takeoff. So an applied force is applied in 90 degrees from that force. So if I pitch the nose down, the effective force is felt on the top of the propeller. That force is actually felt 90 degrees in rotation to the effective force. So that equals it being felt equals it being felt on the right side of our propeller, resulting in more thrust being created on the right side, resulting in a yaw to the left. That's gyroscopic precession. All right, let's talk about load factor. Load factor is the ratio of total air load to the plane's gross weight. So it's the ratio between lift being created to the weight of the aircraft. And load factor is measured in G-forces. So at 2 G-forces, a 100-pound person feels like they weigh 200 pounds. And a 2,000 pound aircraft at 2 Gs is having to support 4,000 pounds of weight. And it's important because it's possible to overload the aircraft, and increasing load factor increases our stall speed. Let me explain this in paint. So when we... Can I make this bigger? Oh, great. So if I've got... I'm just going to draw like a... Let's say this is our plane. And now here's the wings. And that's our propeller. All right, it's like flying towards us. Just gotta use your imagination here. This aircraft, if we're flying straight and level, you know, the aircraft weighs 2,000 pounds, and we're creating 2,000 pounds of lift. So if I'm creating, if I was creating 2,200 pounds of lift, and the aircraft weighs 2,000 pounds, then I would be in a climb. But let's just say, I need a bigger eraser. Let's just say we're creating 2,000 pounds of lift. Now, let's say we have an aircraft that's at a bank. This is a pretty aggressive bank. Trying to draw. Okay. Same aircraft but it's in a bank. Now, it's creating its lift like so. And we still have 2,000 pounds this way. You know, the aircraft still weighs 2,000 pounds. And if this aircraft just turns, you know, kind of like a screwdriver. It's flying along, all of a sudden it just twists like a screwdriver. This aircraft is going to descend because now we're not creating enough lift to support the aircraft's weight. So when we enter a turn, the amount of lift we create gets split into two components: our vertical component of lift and our horizontal component of lift. So when we enter a turn, I'll actually need to create about, now I'm going to use just arbitrary numbers just to make a point. Let's just say like 2,300 pounds of lift. And that would allow me my vertical component of lift to be 2,000 so that I maintain my altitude. And let's just say this is like 300. So our vertical component of lift now equals the weight of the aircraft, allowing the aircraft to maintain altitude. Well, what do we do in order to create additional lift like this? Well, we increase our angle of attack or pull back a little bit on our yoke. So every time we turn the aircraft, in order to maintain our altitude, we pull back on our yoke additionally in order to create more lift so that our vertical component of lift equals our weight, meaning we maintain our altitude. The other portion of lift is our horizontal component of lift, and it's what leads us into the turn. So every time I'm in a turn, remember, our load factor is just our ratio of total air load on the plane, you know, the amount of lift we're creating divided by the weight of the aircraft. So now I'm creating 2,300 pounds of lift, and the aircraft still weighs 2,000 pounds. So this, if you do the math, I don't want to do the math right now, but this would be how much load factor we're experiencing. Now, in reality, at a high bank angle like this, let's delete that. This would probably look more like 4,000. Again, I'm using arbitrary numbers. Let's just say we're at like a 50 degree, 50 degree bank. 2,000. Okay, let's say at this bank angle, we need to make 4,000 total pounds of lift in order for our vertical component to be 2,000 in order to maintain our altitude. So if this was 4,000, then we would be at 2 Gs. So that's why the more we increase our bank angle, the more lift we need to create, the more we need to increase our angle of attack in order to have our vertical component of lift equal our weight. And so that at those higher bank angles, I'm under higher load factors when maintaining altitude. So that's why increasing load factor increases stall speed. When I'm at those high bank angles, I increase my angle of attack, pushing me closer to my critical angle of attack, which means I'll stall the aircraft at a higher speed because I'm increasing my angle of attack at that same given airspeed in a higher bank angle setting. Okay, let's continue here. So we're designed to operate within certain limits. Our normal category, we can sustain up to 3.8 Gs, so 3.8 times the aircraft's, G limit, and negative 1.52. So negative Gs is just if I push the aircraft's nose really far down and you feel light in your seat. So that's where the aircraft is a lot more structurally sound in positive Gs than it is negative Gs. So this is a VG diagram. So our line of maximum lift capability is this top line here. And say I exceed my my limit of my maximum lift capability right here, maybe in a speed right here, the aircraft will just stall and everything will be okay. Beyond my maneuvering speed, if I, for whatever reason, hit a gust of wind that deflects the aircraft up super aggressively and we instantly pull 5 Gs, we're going to run into structural damage. And so when we fly in things like turbulence or we're doing maneuvers, we're always beneath our maneuvering speed. So that way, if our controls get deflected and all of a sudden we're pulling 3 Gs at this airspeed, the aircraft will stall before running into structural damage. And then we have our limit speed, so this never exceed speed, which if we exceed, results in structural failure. So this is giving us an outline for the operating limitations of our aircraft. So we talked about wingtip vortices a little bit before when we were talking about induced drag. Remember, when an airfoil produces lift, there's a high pressure below, low pressure above. That difference in pressure results in these vortices. These vortices will increase induced drag due to the energy spent creating the vortices. So the greater angle of attack we're flying at, the greater the pressure differential, meaning the stronger the vortices. So these vortices will be the strongest when an aircraft is heavy, clean, and slow. The only reason why is because heavy, clean, and slow all result in us having to fly at a higher angle of attack. If I'm flying a heavier aircraft will require a higher angle of attack. A slow aircraft will require a higher angle of attack. And a clean aircraft, remember, flaps increase lift and drag. So if I'm flying at a specified angle of attack with flaps and one without flaps, the aircraft without flaps is having to fly at a higher angle of attack because it doesn't have the aid of those flaps. So a heavy, clean, and slow aircraft will have the most induced drag. So these vortices sink at several hundred feet per minute, slowing over time. And when they reach the ground, they tend to move laterally with the wind. And if you fly into these vortices, that can be hazardous to aircraft, which we'll discuss in, I believe it's the next slide. So I can see in this picture here, we can see these vortices, the effect that they're having on the water here. And so we can see visibly these vortices on runway 28 right here at San Francisco. The crosswind from right to left is blowing these vortices to the left. So from this aircraft that's landing here, these vortices are created. Once they hit the ground, they'll move with the wind. And so we see they're moving with the wind as you see this trail as the vortices interact with the water there. So with the crosswind, decreased movement of the upwind vortex, increased movement of the downwind vortex. So we can see wind is moving right to left here, and we've got increased movement of the downwind vortex here, and we don't have that on the upwind side. With a tailwind, the vortices can move into the touchdown zone. So if we're landing with the tailwind, this wind is moving from down here up, these vortices can move onto the runway, and that could be dangerous. So when we're avoiding wingtip vortices, if we're taking off prior, we want to take off prior to an aircraft's rotation point. So if I'm this aircraft here, or I'm taking off right after this guy here, I want to take off before they take off because I can see their vortices are hanging around down here and sinking. So I want to make sure my flight path is above so I don't run into these vortices. Taking off after a jet's touchdown point. So if I'm taking off after this guy just landed, I'm going to keep my roll going until I get after where they touch down, and then I'm going to take off. En route, avoid flying through another aircraft's flight path within 100 or 1,000 feet. I want to land prior to departing aircraft's takeoff point. So if I'm landing behind this guy taking off, I want to touch down just anywhere before they rotate. And if I'm landing after this aircraft lands, I want to land beyond their touchdown point. So if they touch down right here, I may even want to touch down about halfway down the runway so I avoid all these vortices. So you kind of think about it as just avoid the flight path that aircraft takes and beneath it. And if you just think about it that way, then you're not going to run into it. We don't have to think about wingtip vortices when we're in the pattern and there's just, Cherokees and light sport aircraft and 172s in the pattern. But if you have a jet taking off, like at my home airport, there's Alaska flights operating out of there, then it's definitely something to be wary of. I've turned a low base landing right behind a 737, and I wasn't thinking about it, and I hit the wake turbulence of the 737, and in my base turn, when I was straight and level, all of a sudden the aircraft immediately went to a 45-50 degree bank, and it scared the hell out of me. And that's why it's so important to understand this, because if I'm not paying enough attention to the path that aircraft is taking, then that could potentially lead to a stall and a spin. Because these vortices will drastically reduce the lift of your wing, or even just one side of your wing, one wing and not the other, depending on how you hit this wake turbulence, which is extremely dangerous. So huge lesson learned there. It was one of those moments where I finally saw the practicality of learning about wingtip vortices and from classroom to in real life. So I guess just to say that in summary again, watch where the aircraft's flight path is and stay, if they're landing, above and beyond. If they're taking off, staying above the flight path of the aircraft taking off. Just stay away from the vortices that's created at and beneath the flight path of the larger aircraft. All right, that's it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm got my CFI check ride in about a week, and so I'm just practicing presenting things. If there's anything I can do better, I think I have a lot of room to improve still. So if you leave a comment for anything you're confused about, I'm going to keep practicing this until I can be an excellent communicator and an excellent teacher. I appreciate it.